He came in through the back door. No knock. Just the sound of the latch, and then he was in the room. 56 years old. 15 years of watching him from a distance. Now, he was 4 feet away. He sat down, looked at the table and said, "You already know who they are." I said nothing. He looked up. "You've known since Brussels." Outside, the Mediterranean moved against the Beirut corniche, back and forth, patient. Like it had been doing for 10,000 years, and would keep doing long after this conversation stopped mattering. "Yes," I said. "Since Brussels." He nodded slowly. "Then you know what has to happen next." I did, and it terrified me. Not in the way that field operations produce fear, the kind with a pulse rate and a timeline and an exit vector. In the way that certain realizations terrify, quietly, permanently, without the possibility of unfiling them. The thing I had known since Brussels in 1995 and had been carrying for 8 years was no longer mine alone. It was in the room, and now it had to become something more than a file. Welcome to the gray. Stay with me, because what happened in that safe house in Beirut in March of 2003 is the kind of story that the official record was never meant to contain. Beirut, March 2003, 19 degrees at dawn. The city smelled like jasmine and diesel and something older, the specific scent of a place that has survived things most cities haven't. The safe house was in the Hamra district, West Beirut. 44 square meters. 4th floor. Window facing east. I had been there 9 days when the man I had been tracking for 15 years walked through my back door without knocking. His name, his real name, not the one in the DIA file, not the one in the Jordanian institutional record, doesn't matter for this file. What matters is what he knew. And what he knew should not have been possible for a single person to know, unless that person had been reading something the rest of us had been missing for 20 years. And he had. He had been reading it since before any of us knew there was something to read. Let me back up, because if this is the first file you've opened in this archive, you need 30 seconds of context. If you've been here from the beginning, you already have it skip ahead in your mind. The setup is fast. This account follows a single operational career, 31 years, 7 countries. End. 8. End. One consistent observation: there is always a gap between what intelligence institutions officially say is happening and what is actually happening. Always. In every posting. In every environment. The gap is not a failure of the institution. It is a structural feature of how institutions work. The institution tells one story. The operational reality tells another. The career has been spent living in the space between those two stories, and in Beirut, in March of 2003, that space produced something that changed everything that came before it and everything that came after. Now, back to the room. Yusuf al-Rashid had ordered the meeting, not me. That was the first thing that was wrong with the situation, operationally speaking. In 15 years of carrying his file, 47 words, in 1988, slowly growing across 6 postings, never quite arriving at the significance the file promised, I had never been the one who waited. I had always been the one who approached. The cultivator, the observer, the person with the file and the probability assessment and the careful incremental contact protocol. In Beirut in March 2003, al-Rashid made contact with my operational network, not the other way around. He came to me. He walked through a back door without a knock and sat down across from me and said he had been waiting for this meeting since 1997. 6 years. He had been waiting for 6 years for me to be ready to have it. That detail should tell you something about the kind of person this file describes. Most people, when they know something important, tell someone. This man had been sitting on what he knew for 6 years because he had assessed correctly, as it turned out, that the person carrying his file was not yet in a position to use the information effectively. He had run his own probability assessment on me. From the other side of the file, think about that for a moment. The 4th of March, 2003. 7 days before al-Rashid walked through that door. A dead drop in the years.A neighborhood, third pillar of an arcade building, standard concealment, the same protocol the Istanbul operation had used on the Galata Bridge. The material was 2 pages. Most of it was routine. Then, 6 sentences. 6 sentences that made me sit still for 90 seconds, and then pick up the phone. 6 sentences confirming that the entity I had been watching from my peripheral vision across 3 postings, the one that had run a surveillance team against me in Istanbul in 2001, the one that had moved a triple agent named Şahin out of Istanbul in January of 2002, the one whose operational signature matched no foreign service and no known non-state actor had identified al-Rashid, had him in a file, their file, not mine. The hunter had become someone else's prey, and I had 9 days to do something about it before the window closed. I made coffee, 90 degrees, correct extraction. The machine in the Hamra safe house was the only machine in 4 postings that required no grind adjustment from the first morning. I noted that, filed it. Then I started making calls I wasn't supposed to make. Here is the operational architecture that the next 14 days produced, and I'm going to give it to you straight, because the details matter and the sequence matters. And if you understand the sequence, you understand why the 19th of March 2003 changed the entire trajectory of the account that followed. Al-Rashid contacted my network on March 7th. We set the meeting for the 11th of March, 1930 hours. Hamra Safe House. Between March 7 and March 11, I ran 3 surveillance detection routes through the Hamra district every morning at different hours to confirm the safe house was not under coverage. It wasn't. Whatever the hostile entity knew about al-Rashid, it did not yet know about my Beirut safe house. That window of operational security was the only window we had, and we used it. March 11, 1930 hours. He walked in through the back, sat down. The 4,100 Kelvin desk lamp, the Mediterranean 3 blocks away, and 41 minutes that I recorded on a device in my inside pocket 0.6 meters from his position that I will not reproduce here because the recording is in the physical archive, not this account. But I will tell you what it produced. 3 things. First, the entity that had been running counter-network operations since Istanbul was not foreign, not a rival service, not a non-state actor, not a regional power, American institutional. The same American institutional actor that in Brussels in 1995 had caused an allied service to withhold intelligence from the shared framework, 8 years older, significantly more operationally capable, and now running a systematic operation to identify and neutralize anyone who could see what it was doing in the space between the institution's official story and the operational reality. Second, al-Rashid had known this since 1997. He had documentation, physical documentation, kept outside any institutional system, in locations the entity could not access. Third, he was not the only one. The network, the specific collection of people who had each independently developed the capacity to read what institutions cannot officially see, had been comparing notes for years, without knowing about each other's files, without knowing about the 3rd file I had been keeping since Budapest in 1993, arriving at the same conclusions from different directions, like water finding the same level through different channels. The entity was not hunting foreign assets. It was hunting visibility. It was finding and removing the people who could see it operating in the gap. That is why Şahin disappeared from Istanbul in January 2002. That is why the surveillance team appeared on Istiklal Avenue in December 2001. That is why the Grand Bazaar tale showed up in November 2001. not espionage, not counterterrorism. Visibility management, the systematic elimination of observers. I had been one of those observers since Brussels in 1995, and I had been operational long enough to be still standing in March 2003. The question was, for how much longer? This is the moment I want you to pause on. Not because it is the most dangerous moment in this account, though it may be, because it is the moment the entire career was built to produce. 22 years of operational work in 7 countries, producing the specific calibration required to understand what was being said in a 44-square-meter room in Hamra on a March night in 2003. Every posting a layer, every weight load bearing for the next, every thin patient file a piece of the architecture. The architecture was complete enough to hold what Al-Rashid was placing on it. Just barely, but enough. He finished talking. I drank the coffee, said, "You've known this since Brussels." He said, "I've known it longer than that. You've known it since Brussels." The specific correction mattered. He had known it before I did. He had been waiting for me to catch up. 6 years of waiting. "And you kept your file?" he said. "The file keeps itself," I told him. "That's what files do." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression a person makes when they have been carrying something for a very long time and have just learned they are not the only one who has been carrying it. Not relief. Something quieter. The specific expression of a weight recognized by someone who understands its shape. 4 days later, March 15, East Beirut, the Operative district. A restaurant, 2nd floor, 12 tables, warm amber light at 3,200 Kelvin. Lebanese restaurant lighting, personal, the kind that loosens the professional vocabulary slightly. Ceiling at 2.8 meters, close acoustics, every table audible from the adjacent ones. Al-Rashid arrived 3 minutes early. That detail, a person who runs their own surveillance detection route before a meeting in Beirut in 2003, does not arrive 3 minutes early by accident. They arrive 3 minutes early because the route is complete and they are clean and they have time. I noted the arrival time, filed the implication, 0.71 probability, operational peer. He had ordered water, professional choice, keeps the hands free. I ordered the same. The coffee came with the meal. Extraction wrong, 87 degrees, not 90, bitter at the back of the throat. I set it down. What he said was more important than the coffee. The transit sub-pattern your Istanbul team documented in the Bosphorus traffic, he said. That's not the regional network's infrastructure. That's the entity's mechanism, running inside the legitimate traffic. Using the cover of infrastructure that the legitimate participants don't know is being used, he looked at me. The entity has been running parallel to your network for 6 years. Reading what your people read, using the methodology, staying 1 layer below where the institutional surveillance looks. He set his water glass down. They don't just know about you. They learned from you, and now they're ahead of you. The 7-degree coffee sat untouched on the table. This was not new information in the sense that the elements were unfamiliar. It was new information in the sense that a probability weight of 0.81 becoming 0.96 inches the space of 1 sentence is new information. I had suspected this. Al-Rashid had confirmed it. 0.96. I don't reach 1. The formation maintains 0.04 of epistemic honesty, even when the evidence is overwhelming. But 0.96 is enough to act on. I acted. The 19th of March, 2003. This is the date. Remember it. The same night, the first strikes of Operation Iraqi Freedom hit Baghdad. I am not using that fact for effect. It is simply accurate. The world was reshaping itself that night, and in a safe house in Hamra, the specific reshaping that had been building since 1993 reached its operational moment. 5 people in a 44-square-meter room. Al-Rashid. Catherine Walsh, DIA analyst, Washington, who had traveled to Beirut on legitimate institutional cover. 2 individuals whose names are in the physical archive and not in this account. And myself. 4,100 Kelvin lamp. The Mediterranean outside, doing what it does. Baghdad audible, not through the ears, but through the walls, through every radio and news feed in the city, through the specific atmospheric quality of a night when the world knows something large and irreversible is happening somewhere else. 2 hours and 17 minutes. I will not give you the full conversation. I will give you what it produced. An agreement. 5 people who had each arrived at the same conclusion through entirely different paths, agreeing on one thing. The entity had to be documented, not exposed, not confronted, not brought to any institution. The institution was where the entity lived, documented, in a form the institution could not access, absorb, reclassify, or lose. Physical. Paper. Outside the system. A dead-drop network applied not to intelligence collection, but to intelligence preservation. The same architecture the operational career had built across 7 postings, turned inside out and used to protect the record rather than produce it. The documentation already existed in fragments. My files from Brussels, Istanbul, Beirut, Walsh's analytical products. Al-Rashid's own archive, which he had been maintaining in physical form since 1,997 inches locations that no institutional framework he served had ever accessed. The 2 unnamed contacts had their own pieces. What 5 people agreed to do on the 19th of March 2003, while Baghdad burned, was bring the fragments together. 1 custodian per city, multiple copies, dead drop, access protocols for each location. No digital footprint, no institutional channel. The entity could manage visibility inside the institution. It could not manage visibility it didn't know existed. Here is what I want you to understand, and I am going to say it plainly because this account exists for plain statements as much as for operational precision. The thing that is being documented is real. The entity is real. The operations are real. The names are in the physical archive. In the form, the physical archive takes handwritten, witnessed, dated, cross-referenced. This account is one layer of the documentation, the layer that exists in public, the layer that the entity can see but cannot do anything about because what this account says is true, and truth is specifically difficult to manage through the visibility tools that institutional actors use. This is not the most protected layer of the documentation, but it is the most accessible, and accessibility matters. Because the documentation only works if enough people know it exists, that the entity cannot make it not exist by removing the custodians one at a time. The documentation is its own protection. The wider it is known, the safer it is. Which is why I am telling you, not asking for subscribers, not running a channel, telling you, because you are now part of the documentation's distribution. You have heard this file. You know the archive exists. You know what it contains in outline. You know the method. That knowledge is not transferable from you to the entity in any form that helps the entity. But it is transferable from you to the next person who should hear this account. If that person exists in your network, send them the first file. Start them from episode 1. The order is not decoration. It is load-bearing structure. The weight arrives correctly only in sequence. 4 days after the March 19 meeting, March 23, 0630 hours. I was running 12 minutes late. Security protocol change in the safe house. Operational situation required it. Walking the Beirut Corniche. The Mediterranean doing its patient back and forth. The city still mostly asleep. The Corniche empty in both directions for at least 80 meters. A figure approaching from the south. Single operator. not a tail formation, single, experienced, efficient, in the specific way that someone is efficient after years of doing something rather than months of training for it. He stopped at 1.8 meters. The Mediterranean behind him, the specific distance of a professional contact, close enough to speak without raising a voice, far enough to allow a physical response if the contact turns hostile. 600 milliseconds for the assessment machinery to run. Probability weight, 0.89. Entity connected, 0.09. Shaheen's secondary network, 0.02. All other categories. He said 4 words in English. Levantine accent. Educated in a Western institutional environment, but Levantine native. 4 words. Duh. Duh. I am not reproducing them here. The 4 words are the opening of the next file. What I will tell you is the response time. 1.1 seconds for my decision. His response time to what I said, 0.9 seconds. That symmetry was itself data. A person who responds to an unexpected statement in 0.9 seconds is not surprised by the statement. He had expected what I said, which meant he knew more about this conversation than a random contact should have known, which meant the entity's operational reach was closer than the probability weights had calculated. He walked away, south along the Corniche. I watched him until he was 120 meters away and turned into a side street. Filed the encounter at 0638 hours. Walked back to the safe house. Made coffee. 90 degrees. Correct extraction. Sat with the file and added the encounter and updated the probability weights and registered the implication that the next file would address. The Mediterranean outside moved back and forth against the shore. It was not going anywhere. It did not need to. The patient ones never do. The bank holds. The water moves. The archive grows. 1 word at a time. 1 data point at a time. 1 file at a time. The significance is not approaching anymore. It arrived in Beirut in March. In a 44 square meter room with 5 people and 1 lamp, and Baghdad audible through the architecture of a night that changed everything. Let me tell you what Beirut actually looks like when you're running a covert. Operation inside it. Not the postcard version, the operational version. Because the city is its own kind of weapon. And if you don't understand its geography, you don't understand what was happening in March of 2003. West Beirut and East Beirut are not just geographic designations. They are 2 different operational environments sharing 1 city. West Beirut, Hamra, Raouche. The Corniche runs on a specific institutional logic, secular, cosmopolitan, on the surface, layered underneath with networks that have been redistributing actual power since the civil war ended in 1990. East Beirut Achrafia, Gemaize, Mar Mikhail, runs on a different logic, older, more closed, the specific institutional density of communities that survived the war by building walls, literal and otherwise, between themselves and everything outside. Moving between East and West in Beirut in 2003 was not a neutral act. It was a statement. The movement itself communicated something about who you were and who you knew and what you wanted. The formation had built the capacity to make that movement without the movement being readable as a statement. To appear in both registers of the divided city as someone who was simply there, professionally, with legitimate reason to be in either location. That capacity was the operational cover the Beirut posting required, and that the previous 7 postings had been building without knowing they were building it. The Hamra district in March of 2003 was processing 2 things simultaneously. The first, the American military operation that was about to begin or had just begun in Iraq, depending on which news source you were tracking and what time zone you were in. The second, the specific question of what an American military operation in Iraq meant for a Lebanon still finding its equilibrium after the 2000 Israeli withdrawal from the south and still, nominally, under Syrian influence in its town. Institutional structures. The city was reading the situation the way that cities which have survived genuine catastrophe read situations, carefully, practically, with the specific attention of people who have learned that large events have consequences that the large events architects do not always intend. The cafes on Hamra Street were full at 0900. The conversations were fast and specific, and the people having them were the kind of people who had institutional positions and information networks and genuine stakes in the outcome of what was happening 850 kilometers to the place, east. I walked those cafes every morning, not to collect, to calibrate. The formation had built the habit in every posting. Read the ambient, operational environment before you do anything else in it. The ambient reading in Hamra in March of 2003 was, "The city is watching, not reacting. The professionals know something is coming. The question is what it is, and how long it takes." That ambient reading was the operational context for everything that followed. 5 people in a room agreeing to begin a documentation process on the night the Baghdad airstrike started was not a coincidence of timing. It was the specific product of an operational environment in which the context for action was exactly right. Large event providing cover, institutional attention directed elsewhere. The specific window that large geopolitical moments open for operational decisions that would otherwise be too visible. The entity knew this too. This is the part that the official record doesn't contain and that the account needs to address directly. The entity was not passive in March of 2003. The entity was using the same window, the same large event, providing the same cover. The entity's operational tempo in Beirut had been increasing since January the 3rd files cross-references, the dead drop material of March 4, the surveillance indicators in the years.A neighborhood across the first 2 weeks of March, all pointed to an entity that was moving faster than it had moved in Istanbul in 2001, or in the period between Istanbul, Beirut. The entity had learned something about the network, about the methodology, about the specific window that the Iraq situation was opening. And the entity intended to use the window to close down the network's documentation capacity before the documentation was complete enough to be useful. The race between the documentation and the entity's operation to shut it down was the operational reality of March 2003, not stated in those terms in any institutional file, stated in exactly those terms in the physical archive. Walsh arrived in Beirut on March 17. Official cover: a formal institutional assessment of Lebanon's post-Syria economic trajectory for the European Security Architecture Team's post-Iraq planning process. Legitimate cover. Real institutional work to do. The institutional work was done: 2 briefings, 3 meetings, 1 written assessment that went into the institutional file with her name on it. The institutional record shows she was in Beirut from March 17 to March 22. The institutional record shows she attended the briefings and meetings and produced the assessment. The institutional record does not show the 3rd meeting on March 19. It does not show the specific conversation that took place between Walsh and al-Rashid on the morning of March 19, before the 5-person meeting that evening, in a coffee shop in the Hamra district that I had swept for coverage at 0700 that morning and confirmed clean. That conversation lasted 40 minutes. I was not present for it. I was running my own detection route on the perimeter. What I know about that conversation comes from Walsh's entry in the physical archive, written in her own hand, in the specific form that the documentation process uses, dated, witnessed, cross-referenced, held in multiple copies. Walsh's mechanism: the structural gap reading. The institutional tectonic analysis had been running on the entity's operation independently since her analytical products first documented the specific pattern in early 2002. The morning conversation with al-Rashid was the first time two people who had been analyzing the same object from different angles compared their analyses directly. The convergence was not surprising to either of them. That is what the archive records. It was not surprising because both instruments were accurate, and accuracy applied to the same object from different angles produces the same result. The convergence was confirmation. Not of the conclusion both already had, the conclusion of the method, the independent confirmation that the method was sound. That what they were each seeing was real and not an artifact of their individual analytical positions. This matters. This is not a small thing. Independent confirmation is the specific epistemological standard that distinguishes intelligence from speculation. Walsh and al-Rashid confirmed each other without having coordinated their analyses. The entity was real. The operation was real. The documentation was necessary and would hold. The 5-person meeting that evening ran from 2,000 to 2217 hours. I kept the time log, the 4,100 Kelvin lamp on the table, the Mediterranean outside. Baghdad, somewhere to the east, making a different kind of noise than it had made the day before. 2 hours and 17 minutes to agree on the following. The documentation process would be structured around physical archives with dead drop access protocols, 1 custodian per city, minimum 3 copies per location. The cities, Beirut, Amman, Washington, Geneva, and a 5th location that I will not specify in this account. The documentation already in existence would be transferred to the physical archive over the following 6 months through the standard dead drop methodology adapted for the specific operational geometry of each city. New documentation would be added through the same methodology as it accumulated. The threshold for the documentation being considered sufficient to withstand exposure, sufficient to bring it to a form in which it could be presented to an external review mechanism without the entity being able to absorb, neutralize it, was a question that none of the 5 people in the room could answer that night. Because the threshold depended on the documentation's completeness, and the documentation's completeness depended on access and time, and access and time were both constrained by the entity's continuing operation to reduce the number of people who could contribute to the documentation. The threshold was moving. The target was moving. The documentation had to grow faster than the entity could close it down. That was the specific operational race that the March 19 agreement defined. 5 people in a room deciding to run a race that none of them could guarantee they would win, not because they were uncertain about the conclusion, because the race itself was the constraint. Time, access, the entity's tempo, these were the variables that the agreement could not control. What the agreement could control was the method, and the method was sound. Al-Rashid and Walsh had confirmed that independently 24 hours before. The method was sound. The documentation would grow. Whether it would grow fast enough was the question that the 19th of March, 2003 left open. I want to stop here and tell you something about what it feels like to be in a room where 5 people are having that specific conversation. Because the operational precision of this account tends to produce a specific misreading that the people in these files are processing everything analytically, mechanically, without the weight of the personal register. That is not accurate. The formation builds the capacity to process under pressure without the processing being overwhelmed by the emotional register. It does not eliminate the emotional register. It assigns it to a different part of the architecture. The weight of what 5 people agreed to do on the 19th of March 2003 was real and present in the room. Walsh was 40 years old. Al-Rashid was 56. The 2 unnamed contacts had their own ages and their own specific weights that the physical archive records, and this account does not. I was 42. 5 people in middle life deciding to maintain a physical archive of documentation on an entity with significant institutional power and an active operation to eliminate the observers. The probability assessment that any given custodian would be able to maintain their role for the duration of the documentation process was not calculated that night. The calculation would have been too precise an instrument for what the conversation required. What the conversation required was the specific kind of commitment that people make when they understand what they are agreeing to and agree anyway. Not recklessness, not idealism. The specific combination of professional competence and personal conviction that produces operational decisions that look, from the outside, like courage. From the inside, they look like clarity. You see the situation accurately. You assess the options. You act on the best option. The weight of acting is real. The action is still the correct action. You carry the weight and you act. The formation builds the carrying structure for exactly this. The architecture holds. The March 23 Corniche encounter with the forward contact was not the last operational incident in the Beirut posting. There were 3 more, each documented in the physical archive, each indicating that the entity's operational tempo was continuing to increase, each providing a data point that the next file will address. What I will say here, in this file, as the Beirut file closes, is what those 3 incidents collectively indicated. The entity was not going to wait for the documentation to be complete. The entity was going to act before the threshold was reached. The specific form that action would take, and the specific operational response the documentation network mounted, and the specific outcome that the response produced, that is the content of what comes after this. The account is not finished. The significance is still arriving. In smaller pieces now, more operationally specific, more consequential, but still arriving. Because the documentation grew faster than the entity could close it down. Not because the network was faster than the entity, because the method was sounder. The dead drop network applied to documentation preservation is specifically harder to shut down than the dead drop network applied to intelligence collection, because the documentation network's nodes do not need to communicate with each other in real time to function. Each node grows the documentation independently. The entity cannot close the documentation by eliminating a single node, or 2 nodes, or 3. The entity would need to eliminate all 5 simultaneously. 5 cities, 5 custodians, 5 dead drop systems, 5 physical archives. The entity never managed it. The entity came close, closer than the probability weights predicted it would, but not close enough. The documentation survived. The physical archive exists. The account is one layer of it, the most visible layer, the layer that the entity can see and cannot close. Because truth is specifically difficult to manage through the visibility tools that institutional actors use. Stay with this account, not because the story gets more dramatic, but the operational details become more specific and more constrained in subsequent files, not more cinematic, because the story gets more true. The closer it gets to the present, the less the formation's vocabulary applies, and the more the plain language of what happened applies. What happened is that 5 people decided to maintain a record that the institution was not going to maintain, and the record was maintained, and it is still growing, and you are part of its distribution network now, whether you intended to be or not. That is what this file does. It transfers the knowledge of the archive's existence. Every person who hears this file is a custodian of the knowledge that the archive exists, not the archive itself, the knowledge. That is enough. That is the specific form of protection that the most visible layer of the documentation provides. One thing the physical archive contains that this account has not yet addressed, and it belongs here because it is the specific kind of operational detail that the formation files and that the account exists to transmit. The dead drop in the years.A neighborhood, the one that produced the 6 sentences on the 4th of March 2003, was not the only dead drop active in Beirut during the posting. There were 3. The years.A arcade location. A second location in the Mar Mikhail district, East Beirut. A small compartment behind a loose stone in the wall of a 19th century building on a specific street whose name and number are in the physical archive. And a third location on the corniche itself, in a maintenance access point beneath a specific bench at a specific distance from the Pigeon Rocks, accessible only during the window between 0545 and 0600, when the corniche maintenance crew had not yet begun their morning sweep. 3 dead drops, different districts, different operational geometry. The formation's standard practice in a high-tempo operational environment, redundant access, no single point of failure. The entity had identified the years.A location by March 17. I know this because the physical counter-surveillance indicators at that location changed between March 15 and March 17 inches, the specific way that a location changes when it has been examined by a professional. The Mar Mikhail and Corniche locations were not compromised during the posting. The documentation transferred through those locations survived intact. The years.A location was shut down on March 16. The material it had held was already in the physical archive. The entity closed an empty drop. That is the specific kind of operational outcome that careful architecture produces. By the time the adversary closes a location, the location's content is already somewhere the adversary doesn't know to look. The formation had been building this specific capacity since Bonn in 1988, the redundant dead drop network, the patient sequencing. The specific discipline of never placing material in a location until the material has been confirmed for extraction. 15 years of practice applied to a 10-day documentation transfer window in March of 2003. The architecture held. Al-Rashid left Beirut on March 28. Not disappeared, the way Shaheen had disappeared from Istanbul. Left. With a specific exit protocol that the physical archive documents and that I had confirmed was clean through the surveillance detection assessment, I ran on his route from the Hamra district to the airport. Clean exit. Not under coverage. The entity did not have his departure under surveillance, which meant either the entity had not yet decided to act against him directly, or the entity was managing his exit rather than preventing it. The probability assessment, 0.62 to the former, 0.38 to the latter. The 0.38 went into the archive. Al-Rashid's custodianship of the Amman archive node was the specific operational role that required him to be in Amman rather than Beirut. The exit was operational, not evasive. He was not running. He was moving to his position. That distinction, which the probability assessment could not confirm to higher than 0.62 certainty at the time, was confirmed later by the Amman node's first documentation edition, which arrived in the dead drop network in May of 2003, and which was specifically signed by Al-Rashid in the form the physical archive requires. He was in position. The documentation was growing. The race was running in the network's favor by approximately 3 weeks, 3 weeks ahead of the entity's operational tempo. In the specific race that the March 19 agreement had defined, 3 weeks was not a comfortable margin, but it was a margin. The bank holds by its margins. The current's force is what it is. The margin is what the architecture produces through patience and redundancy, and the specific discipline of not exposing the location until the material is already somewhere else. Walsh left on March 22, institutional cover intact. The formal assessment submitted, the briefings attended, the official record showing exactly what it was designed to show. A routine institutional visit by a competent analyst producing a routine institutional product. The institutional record did not show the March 19 meeting, or the morning conversation with Al-Rashid, or the specific role Walsh would take in the Geneva documentation node. The institutional record showed exactly what Walsh wanted it to show. The formation had taught this. Walsh had not needed the formation to teach it. She had learned it through her own years of operating in the space between what institutions say and what they do, another path to the same destination. The archive has 2 signed entries from Walsh, covering the Beirut period. They are among the most precise analytical documents in the physical archive. The structural gap reading applied to the entity's operation as documented across multiple postings and multiple operational environments. Two documents that could not exist in the institutional record. Two documents that will exist in the physical archive for as long as the custodians can maintain their nodes. The formation's contribution to the documentation, operational methodology, contact protocols, the specific dead drop architecture. Walsh's contribution, analytical precision, the institutional pattern analysis, the specific form of clarity that comes from reading the gap in systems rather than in rooms. Different instruments. The documentation is better for having both. The Beirut posting ended in June, not dramatically. The operational situation that the March meetings had produced was stable by May. The documentation transfer complete, the nodes active. The entity's operational tempo having plateaued at a level that the network's architecture could manage without direct engagement. No final confrontation. No resolution. Intelligence operations do not produce resolutions. They produce states. The Beirut posting produced a state in which the documentation existed, and the entity knew the documentation existed and could not close it down. That state was the operational victory, not dramatic, permanent. The bank holds. The current keeps running. The documentation accumulates. The entity cannot eliminate what it cannot find, and cannot find what it does not know to look for, and does not know to look for what the method was specifically designed to hide from institutional search protocols. This is how operational victories work in the specific register where this account operates. Not with a shot fired, or a border crossed, or a file transmitted. With a physical archive in 5 cities, each node growing, each custodian in position, each dead drop protocol clean, the significance had arrived. And it was exactly as heavy as 22 years of architecture had been built to hold the gray operative. Every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. The architecture holds. The significance is still arriving. Stay in the shadows.